So this is the second of a two-part series on the Middle East and U.S. foreign policy. The first part focused quite a bit on Arab nationalism and the Kurds and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This piece is going to focus much more on the Sunni-Shia split, which I think is really critical to understanding the balance of power in the current Middle East and some of the challenges the United States has been struggling to manage. So I want to begin with just a brief overview of this idea of political Islam. We had talked about how Arab nationalism had been sort of the mechanism that Arab states had used to legitimize themselves following independence. But after repeated attempts to drive Israel from the Middle East, after making that sort of a cornerstone of Arab nationalism, that this was a way to restore dignity and honor to the Arab world, there was a real disillusionment on the part of the populations across the Middle East with what Arab nationalist leaders had brought about. And largely, I would say Arab nationalist leaders were discredited, viewed as corrupt, viewed as unable to actually accomplish the goals they had set out, and had become increasingly repressive, and yet had not sort of achieve this goal of returning the Arab world to greatness. And so people were looking for alternative political movements. And one that sort of emerges is built around the centrality of Islam. And again, Arab nationalism tried to de-emphasize Islam as part of its sort of secular worldview. Whereas sort of a new wave of political movements is really looking to use Islam as a way to legitimize sort of political action, right? And I want to quickly draw an important distinction between political Islam versus maybe militant Islam, right? Militant Islam is sort of what we might think of when we think of, terrorist groups like ISIS, where a terrorist organization is using religion as part of its justification for its actions. Whereas political Islam is really just saying, as a central part of our politics, this religious identity that we have needs to be woven into that in some concrete and direct way. Political Islam emerges in a couple different ways across the Middle East, starting in the late 1970s. And I want to just quickly flag a couple of these, and this will become relevant later as we talk more about the Sunni-Shia split. So in 1979, you get a occupation of the Grand Mosque in Saudi Arabia by a group of demonstrators that are calling for the overthrow of the monarchy. The government is able to put down this protest, but is really rattled by it and senses that maybe control is slipping away. And the Saudi monarchy cuts a deal with the religious leaders of Saudi Arabia and basically says, as long as you don't seek to overthrow us, you can more or less do what you want in terms of religious policy. And so we'll embrace Sharia law, and we'll stop being quite as tolerant of Western influences. Saudi Arabia had this burgeoning film industry in the 1970s that just essentially gets crushed under a whole wave of new regulations and rules. And Saudi Arabia's foreign policy is sort of governed over the next couple of years by trying to demonstrate how aggressively supportive of political Islam Saudi Arabia can be. Hold that, because we're going to circle back to that. Another place where we see political Islam emerge is in Pakistan. Pakistan, again, we had talked about, was a country that was created as sort of the majority Muslim areas of the former British South Asian sort of Indian Empire. And Pakistan had long sort of struggled with this idea about what does that mean in terms of the state of Pakistan? Is Pakistan a Muslim state, or is Pakistan a state for Muslims? And earlier Pakistani leaders had largely gone in the direction of Pakistan as a state for Muslims, rather than seeing Islam as an important part of Pakistan's political identity. But General Zia, who comes to power in the early 1980s, shifts that significantly, both out of his own personal piety, but also out of a desire to legitimize himself. He really leans into and embraces the idea that Pakistan is a Islamic country, it is a Muslim state, and that Muslim identity should be sort of expressed into policy. And this then sort of converges with what's happening in Saudi Arabia and gets expressed in Afghanistan, where you have a civil war and a Soviet occupation. and Pakistan and Saudi Arabia work together. Saudi Arabia is sending sort of radicalized young men to Pakistan to help fight in Afghanistan. Saudi Arabia is funneling clerics to Pakistan to set up madrasas, religious schools in Pakistan to educate Afghan refugees. And Pakistan is looking to sort of build up religious militant networks, first with Mujahideen fighters, and then later after the Soviet Union leaves, by sort of helping to build up a Taliban movement that can take control of Afghanistan and sort of impose sort of a political Islam government, focused government around Afghanistan. So you've got this sort of movement of Shia countries that are sort of embracing political Islam. Not all Shia countries do. Egypt very aggressively tries to stomp out political Islam, particularly in the form of the Muslim Brotherhood, and retain its sort of secular character. Likewise, there's a number of attempts to introduce increasing doses of political Islam into Turkey that the military sort of quashes under the grounds of their preserving the secular identity of the Turkish state. Within sort of the Shia community, we see political Islam emerge first in Iran as a reaction to the brutality of the US-backed dictator in the form of the Shah, and Iranians taking to the streets and overthrowing the Shah, and clerics coming to power and creating a form of government that puts sort of clerical authority sort of as almost like a Supreme Court level of power, giving it sort of a veto over policy and even politics. And then the second place where we see sort of political Islam emerging within the Shia is Hezbollah, which is sort of a militant religious movement that emerges in southern Lebanon among the Shia, and is fostered and encouraged by Iran. So we're seeing this sort of shifting toward political Islam all across the Middle East, but it only is in the last maybe 2 decades or so that split between the Sunnis and Shias of countries mobilizing around their religious identities has really led to sort of a geopolitical split within the Middle East. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But I want to quickly flag that most Middle Eastern states are predominantly Sunni, but oftentimes have large Shia populations, which are more or less excluded from power, particularly in places that embrace political Islam. Whereas Iran, by contrast, is a majority Shia state with pockets of Sunni population. Historically, Iran was a very powerful regional actor, but in recent years was largely constrained by other actors around it, particularly a hostile United States following the Iranian Revolution, particularly hostile Iraq following the Iran-Iraq War. And even though Iran had, a large population base and significant oil wealth, it wasn't necessarily able to mobilize that as effectively, but it was able to draw upon informal linkages of Shia communities across the Middle East, and to sort of connect with those movements and help agitate for greater political influence for those groups. And so we see the sparks of that in Iraq, where Iran had longstanding ties to the Shia community in the south of Iraq, helping to push against Saddam Hussein. We've seen connections with Iran in Yemen to the Shia community there, to Hezbollah in Lebanon. And I've got just sort of this quick little map I'll show you that maybe helps to illustrate sort of what this dynamic looks like, that you have this large Shia area, the dark green, in Iran, but much of the rest of the Middle East is the lighter green of the Shia, except for those sort of little pockets where you see, lighter green of the Sunnis, except for those little darker green pockets in Yemen and Syria and Lebanon, where you see Sunni populations. And again, this has become a really salient dividing line in the modern Middle East security situation, because the major flashpoints that could spark a regional war are really at their core a fight between Sunnis and Shias. So if we're looking at the Yemen civil war, it is largely a function of that sort of Sunni pocket against the Shia pocket, with the Shia pocket against the Sunni pocket, with the Shia pocket being backed by Iran and being bombed mercilessly by the Sunni Saudi government. If we look at what's going on in Syria, right? Syria has a large Sunni population, but the ruling government is not Sunni. It's a different sect that's similar in ways to Shia, but not. But then you also have this Syrian regime being backed by Hezbollah, which has really looked at a partnership between Syria and Iran as critical to maintaining Hezbollah's sort of viability as a militant organization. And so again, we're seeing that tie-in of the Sunni Shia split in Syria as well. And a lot of what's driving this is not just sort of religious differences, it's a balance of power thing that Iran has really benefited in the last decade or two. For years, as I said, having Iraq on its border, a hostile government in the form of Saddam Hussein, really limited Iran's options in terms of its foreign policy. But when the US toppled Saddam Hussein and replaced Iraq with a democratic government, that democratic government brought Shias with connections to Iran to power, and suddenly a government that had been quite hostile to Iran is now, if not an ally to Iran, at least friendlier to Iran. Likewise, Iran has been able to shrug off some of the sanctions that the United States was able to put on it. So over the Bush administration in the early 2000s and into the first half of the Obama administrations, the United States worked very aggressively to tighten down economic sanctions and really squeeze off Iran's access to the global economy as a way of leveraging Iran to the bargaining table to get rid of their nuclear weapons program. That more or less succeeded. Iran sort of walked back their nuclear weapons program, and as a result, those sanctions sort of got loosened up a little bit, which has been to the benefit of Iran. But with the Trump administration sort of jettisoning the nuclear agreement with Iran, it's sort of driven a wedge between the United States and allies in Europe, and also with the United States and Russia, making it really difficult for the US to reassert those kind of sanctions, the punishing sanctions that the US had been able to build over the course of decades before the Iran nuclear deal. And so as a result, Iran is in a much stronger position than it has been in recent memory. And as a result, Sunni Arab states are in something of a panic, concerned about this sort of rising powerful Iran that might potentially, upend Sunni Shia relations in Yemen and Bahrain and elsewhere, looking for ways to possibly check Iran. So whether that means renewing cooperation with Israel and de-escalating the conflict there. And so I think that's a useful way of thinking about the recent sort of détente between the United Arab Emirates and Israel as an extension of reducing security concerns and possibly even cooperating with Israel in conflict against Iran. We've seen various Arab states sort of work together in much more close coordination in an effort to prevent Iran from gaining influence in places like Yemen and in places like Syria.